are doing a video that I have been threatening you with for quite some time now, and that is doing a series check-in slash autopsy of what has gone wrong in some of my reading recently. So I've alluded to this in several videos ever since I started getting a little slumpy, but I had two video concepts or projects that kind of simultaneously worked together to put me into probably the worst slump of my life. And one of them was reading all of these long books. There is an overlap of a couple of the books we're going to talk about today with that. The other is I had selected 8 series that I had the first book for that I wanted to read this year, that I wanted to start and see like, hey, do I want to actually finish this series, or do I just want to call it sort of like a one and done, DNF it, whatever. On the face of it, sounds very innocuous, right? Wrong. So, let me start by just giving you maybe the rundown on like what I'm gonna do with these different series and my overall thoughts. And then let's get into the meat of this video, which is me discussing how I think I accidentally have ruined high fantasy for myself for the second time in my life. Not forever, but just for now. So, let's start with ones where I enjoyed the first book, but I'm not going to keep going. So for that, I don't think I have any of these that I hated. But for that I have 3. One is The Grace of Kings by Ken Liu. This one is very well written, but it is a high fantasy that is not very character driven, and I just didn't connect or care enough about the plot to feel compelled to keep going. But I gave this 4 stars. I think it's good. It's just not drawing me in further. I have heard from folks that they think it gets better, but you know, we're coulda, woulda, shoulda, we're just sort of beyond that point now, and I now associate this book and another one we're going to talk about with my slump, so I couldn't give the series a fair shake even if I wanted to. Prince of Fools by Mark Lawrence, I gave 3 stars. I think this is fine. Let me talk about this more once we get to the fantasy portion of this, but I read the first book. It was okay. In the Bleak Midwinter by Julia Spencer Fleming, I actually think is very good. I gave this 4 stars, and I think that it is really well written. It's like literary mystery. Yeah, I don't have like criticisms of this other than as a series where it leaves off in terms of sort of what it's setting up. I'm just fundamentally uninterested in reading. So for that reason, I'm not going to keep going. But if you're looking for literary mystery, I can see why this is a really well-loved series. So we have those. We've got a couple that I am not going to read the whole series, but I already have 1 or more books on my TBR from these 2 series, and I'll finish what I have, but I'm not going to add this to my list of series I'm trying to complete. These are not going to be completionist ones for me. One is The Beekeeper's Apprentice by Laurie R. King, which is the first Mary Russell novel. This is 4.5 stars. This is an excellent book, but it is setting up a romantic relationship that I'm just not into and don't want to read more about. So I do have a short story collection that I think is a 0.5 after this. Like, I think it's 1.5. So I'll read that, but I'm not going to seek out more. But I would, if the romantic relationship dynamic in this doesn't bother you, I would highly recommend this, because this was one of the best books I've read this year. It was excellent. And then Peter the Latvian by George Simenon. This is a classic mystery series. This is the first one. I have heard from several people that this isn't a great place to start. I thought this was fine, and I do have a couple more in this McGray series that I already have. So I'll read those. They're short. They're, you know, classic mystery fun, but this was a little bit more spy thriller-y kind of vibe to it than what I thought it would be or what I want. But again, I've heard this is not necessarily representative of the series as a whole. And then the only one that I've officially DNF'd is The Girl in the Stars by Mark Lawrence. This is a spin-off from his Red Sister trilogy. Let's pause my thoughts until we talk about fantasy more. But again, in general, the writing is good. I don't have a problem with this. This is more of a where I'm at in my fantasy reading journey issue. And then I've got two I've not finished yet. So one is Amberlow by Laura Elena Donnelly. I did a writing check on this one of if I'm liking the writing or not. And I am. The writing is very nice. It reads sort of, it is definitely reminiscent of the period in terms of the way the prose is structured. It's very nice prose. So I would probably describe this as literary alternative history fantasy. And I do plan to finish this, though I am taking it off of my immediate TBR. And I don't know, we'll see what happens. I have no idea if I'm going to keep going in this series or not, but I am going to at least finish this book. That decision I've made. And then Cold Magic, I'm in the middle of the audiobook for this, and I'm very much enjoying this steampunky whatever thing, however you want to describe this. But this was part of what was putting me in a slump. So I actually think I need to put this in deep freeze and give it a couple of years before I come back to it, because I so associate it with when I was being slumped that I just don't think I could enjoy it the way that I was enjoying it before that was happening. So we've got 6 I've made decisions on and 2 that I'm currently still reading. So let's get to the actual, like, aside from what I learned about myself with fantasy, is there anything else I learned about myself in this process? I mean, I'm glad that this made me go ahead and actually start some of these series. I do think it's interesting that so far the only one of these I'm pretty sure I'll read all of eventually is I only have one. So I guess maybe part of what I can take from this is looking to see if I have any other beginnings of series that have been on my TBR for a good amount of time and going ahead and giving them a try. That might be a good takeaway, because I think maybe some of these older series I'm just not as interested in anymore. So I think, you know, that's an interesting data point. The only other thing, and the main thing we're going to talk about, is that I think I've accidentally ruined fantasy for myself again. Now, what do I mean by this? For those of you familiar with the deep like woe lore, you will know that up until I read the Robin Hobb series, and if I'm titling this the way I think I will, this is where she comes in. Prior to Robin Hobb, my all-time favorite fantasy series was a very basic bitch answer, and that was Tolkien. I was a Tolkien girly. I read the books in high school. I had originally tried to read them in middle school after I read The Hobbit, and I couldn't keep track of the names. Like, I think I just wasn't ready to follow high fantasy like that. But after I saw the first movie and kind of got oriented on who was who, because this was coming out when I was in like middle school, high school, I was like, oh, okay, let me pick these back up, because now I get the overall like world and whatever, the setup. Read them, loved them, have read those books several times, took a seminar on them in grad school. Like, I love Lord of the Rings. So after that, I thought, like, well, that clearly means I love high fantasy. So I read, and you know, I had read a lot of high fantasy prior to that, but that was the first, like, epic, really long fantasy that I had read and enjoyed. So after that, I attempted to continue that, because I thought, oh, I found something I like. And I just never had success with it. Like, I did not like the Wheel of Time books. I read that first one and didn't like it then. Tried to reread it and hated it even more now. There was several kind of those bigger fantasy books that were out at the time that I DNF'd or just didn't connect with. And kind of just went back to my comfort zone, which at the time was classics, literary, general fiction, and memoirs, nonfiction, mystery. That was sort of the core of my reading at that time. And I kind of forgot that I had that fantasy phase or fantasy love, because I just couldn't really make progress in other series. And in retrospect, what I realized was that Tolkien had kind of ruined a lot of high fantasy for me, because it was so good. It was so good. It was so well written. It had a lot of themes and layers, and it did it sort of in that mode. It was the first one to do it like that, and so many people were just trying to copy what he was doing, particularly when I had graduated. Like, a lot of the high fantasy that got promoted or pushed was in very basic bitch medieval fantasy worlds that were trying to be like Tolkien. Like, it was a lot of Tolkien heavily inspired would probably be the nicest way to say it. I was about to say ripoff, but you know, every genre has sort of titans who come in and spawn 1,000 copyist or inspired by type works. There's not anything intrinsically wrong with that. It just, I wasn't getting into it because it was like, well, but this is just not as good. Like, this isn't Tolkien, so like, why are you pretending to be Tolkien? Okay. So I had to let fantasy simmer for a very long time before I started getting back into some of these like chunkier epic fantasies. And I would say even amidst that, and I should go back and look and see if this is true on the channel, but in general, I think you'll notice a lot of the fantasy that I have tended to like are shorter fantasy series, shorter fantasy books, novellas. I love a fantasy novella. I like fantasy mixed in with other genres, so I tend to like fantasy romance or fantasy mystery. I wouldn't say that I have ever identified as like, I love epic fantasy, and every time I've kind of tried to make myself be more of a reader that way, I don't know that I've ever been wholly successful. But especially because there's a lot of booktubers that I follow and enjoy their content, I've definitely tried a lot more kind of higher traditional fantasy in the last few years, and especially ones that have like non-medieval based worlds. That has been something I've enjoyed. Okay, well, cut to. Me and Leanna from Leanna's Library finished last year our multi-year reading of the Robin Hobb Farseer Realm of the Elderlings 16-book extravaganza. And it was amazing. Like, I loved that reading process. It was really wonderful to read with her because then I had someone to talk about the books with. If you're curious about our thoughts, we did live shows on her channel, I think, after pretty much every book. And that was a really wonderful experience. We also had buddy read because of the Blades and Bodice book club that we're both in, and then just us liking reading things together. We had read a couple of other things together. None of them were ever as successful, but I still enjoyed them. Like, I would say the most successful other thing we read together, and thank God, because I don't know if she would still be my friend if I hadn't liked these, but the Joe Abercrombie Blade Itself trilogy. I really enjoyed those, especially as a whole. Like, that's one that I think of the parts as being bigger than the whole. Like, the sum of the parts is greater than the whole because it's a good story. It has an interesting point of view. It's grimdark, but not like in a sort of like boring way, which we'll get to. It, like, I don't know. I felt like the writing and the character work and the ideas in it were meaty enough that it was really interesting. Okay, so then we had another really good like tentpole high, like, or not, epic fantasy, long fantasy series that Mara likes. Yay. Okay, good. So like further proving, okay, there are high fantasy things I can like. I think those since then, I just keep striking out with high fantasy. I've tried a bunch of them and DNF'd a lot. I've also not enjoyed some of the high fantasy trilogy mainstays that everybody else has really loved. Like, I liked Jade City, but I liked that less as it went along. And I think you've heard me talking on the channel in the last couple of years about, like, are books too long? Are they, are they just long to be long in the speculative space? And some books that are long in that space I still enjoy. I think a great example of that would be Black Sun by Rebecca Roanhorse. That trilogy I really loved. And actually I think it should have been more books because I think the last book kind of condenses a lot of stuff and it should have been a quartet instead of a trilogy. So I definitely have exceptions to that, but in general, I think you've heard a lot of me talking about, I think a lot of these books are just too long. Some of that I think is my own just personal taste. I tend to really enjoy, this is something else that I've discovered in this kind of slumping process of reading those longer books. I really enjoy the feeling of being able to get through a book pretty quickly. For me, that's how I stay excited about it these days. That's the best way to, for my concentration to work. When I was younger, I used to be a very multiple books going at one time kind of reader. And as time has gone on, I'm much more of a monogamous book reader in the sense of I'm reading one and getting through it. Maybe I'll also have an audio going in tandem with something else, but that's really about it. So I think there is an element of this of just like how I best enjoy stories, how my brain works. There's some of that. There is an element though that I think, trying to be as objective as possible, I do think a lot of these books are very overwritten. They're not well edited, and I think that's frankly because the publishing industry is putting less and less of its resources towards editorial. I think especially with some of these big names, they just don't get editing anymore. And I'm sitting here thinking, I do have exceptions to this. Like, I do like the Poppy War trilogy. But I think when I'm thinking through some of these exceptions, they're not the super long books. They're long high fantasy, but they're not the like 800-page ones or whatever. Okay, so cut to, in particular, these two, where these are pretty long books. Cold Magic is over 500. This one, I think, also coming up on 600 pages. These are long books. I've seen from a Robin Hobb book what a long fantasy book can do in terms of character, plot, pacing, and world building and writing. For me, she is the best fantasy writer I've ever read. She does it all. I mean, obviously I have critiques of different books. Like, I'm not saying she's perfect, but as a whole, she is certainly now, I would say, my favorite fantasy author. And I just kind of wonder if seeing what a long book can do in that epic high fantasy vein, I kind of wonder if I just have a little bit of Robin Hobb hangover in long fantasy. I think I might not be being fair to these books, because I wonder if there's just a part of my mind that's always like, well, but yeah, this is good, but is it Robin Hobb? Like, why am I just not rereading Robin Hobb right now? So I kind of think maybe she is my new Tolkien for epic and or just long high fantasy, that I've found one that really worked for me and that I'm struggling to find other things that work for me nearly as well. Now, I would say a difference is there's not a bunch of Robin Hobb imitators I'm trying to read. We'll get to that distinction here in a second, but I just think maybe I'm just not in the mood for long fantasy right now. So with that in mind, I think this one can stay on my TBR because it is fantasy, but it's not, I think because it has more of an urban fantasy kind of setting, an alternative history kind of setting, it's shorter. I think maybe this is more the direction I need to go with my fantasy reading for now. I think fantasy novellas are a good place for me. And then authors that I already know I like what they do in fantasy. So like T. Kingfisher. I think all of that might be a better route. I would also say I have a little bit of comparison issues for this from Mark Lawrence, because I really did love the Red Sister trilogy, and I just was struggling to get into this part of the world and this story. I just wasn't into it. And maybe that's Hobb, maybe that's just it's not giving me what I wanted like Red Sister did. I don't know. But it's just not for me right now. And again, once again, hearkening back to the like, they did it better, more so when there's a direct comparison. I really struggled in this being like, why am I not just reading some more Joe Abercrombie? Like, this isn't bad. I think if you're a grimdark lover and you want to read everything grimdark, I can totally see why people would like this series. But for me, I think I kind of found the flavor of that I like. Because frankly, Robin Hobb is pretty frickin' grim as well. So like, there's that. And then if I want like true, like genre-wise, like something that I would describe as grimdark, I think I would just read Joe Abercrombie. So I think I'm just fantasy, straight up fantasy, I don't think is a comfort genre for me. And so I think I need to stop treating it like, if it's a plot that appeals to me, cool, I'll just pick it up. Because I think I'm just a little pickier and a little harder to please in this genre. There are things in it that I absolutely love. Like, as I'm sitting here, I'm like, I really liked Red Sister. There are definitely things that I love in fantasy. And I think something else I'm realizing is I really love fantasy as a mix-in. It's a great element to a story. Like, I always say that my favorite kind of combination is a mystery plot engine in a fantastical setting with a strong romantic element. Like, those, if you got those three things, that's like really my sweet spot of comfort reading. So it's not like I'm completely getting rid of speculativeness. But I think I'm just not in a place where I'm in like a long, chunky fantasy reading mode. And I think trying to make myself read those right now, at least, is not a good idea. I think I frankly need to get just like more distance between definitely me and Robin Hobb. And also, maybe I just need to spend my energy reading some more Joe Abercrombie right now. Like, read through that. Maybe don't start some new series right now. I'm looking over here, the only long fantasy series starter I think I still have is The Will of the Many. And I did a writing check on it in terms of reading the first little bit, and I was enjoying the writing. So maybe I'll try that, but unless I can't see it, I think really that might be the last one for a while. Like, I just need to stay away from that for right now. Oh, the other thing is YA fantasy. I definitely have found that the trope set in that and the melodramatic writing in that, it's just not for me right now. So I think I need to stay away from that too in fantasy. So I think that means really what I'm looking for in fantasy right now are shorter books that are more Amber Low, which I think is about 350 pages. So like 400 pages or less, I think is probably where I need to stick. I love a novella, so I think that would be a good route for me for high fantasy. I think I need to stick with, if it's a longer book, I think it needs to be an author I already know I like T. Kingfisher, I think has probably still a book less than 400 pages, but a new one coming out that I have an arc for that I'm sure I will enjoy because I like that author. I think cozy fantasy is good for me. That I'm still really enjoying. I think middle grade fantasy is still a great place for me. So like Percy Jackson and Amari and the Night Brothers and some of the graphic novel fantasy stuff I've been reading in middle grade. I think all of that works for me in terms of the tone and writing. And then fantasy as an additive to romance, I think also is a good route for me right now. So fantasy romance or romantasy or romantic fantasy, like all of that stuff I think is still potentially a good route. So yeah, it's not really what I was expecting to talk about in this update about my series, but I keep threatening to have a more of a discussion video about this. So here it is. And we'll see how this goes. I think I at least feel good that I feel like I have a hypothesis of what's not working for me. And so we'll test that hypothesis through my reading for the next, honestly, probably couple of years and see if I can kind of get back to a place where longer fantasy sounds good to me again and sounds like something I want to try again. But all of this, as I verbally process this with you, is making me realize I need to let Leanna know I'm ready for a full-on Abercrombie read-along. And you can probably hear her cries of delight from your home right now. Because I think that might be the place for me to, and the fact that I have somebody to talk about it with, I think also helps with some of those longer books. So yeah, I think that might be where we're at, guys. So anyway, I hope this was vaguely interesting to someone. Let me know if you relate to anything I'm talking about, if you totally have an opposite experience, or just, I don't know, how you have reflected on your changing tastes over time. I hope you're having a great day. Hit the bell if you want to know when I'm posting next, and I will talk to you soon. Bye!